The global drug industry is a multi-billion rand industry. It's valued at more than many global south countries, the economies. There's more money in the global drugs trade than many small, economically burgeoning countries. And South Africa has been a focal point for the drug trade, particularly because of its geographical position at the southernmost tip of Africa. Easy to connect South America, Europe, Asia, and the East from our focal point here in South Africa. But the drug trade is just but one of the many industries in the global illicit trade network. I first want to introduce our first guest, Caryn Dolley. She's the author of Clash of the Cartels. It looks at how there's been collusion, complicit politicians and police, and also looking at how South Africa's history plays into the story of how South Africa is this focal point for the international drug trade. Caryn, thanks so much for joining us. Aron, I'll be with you shortly, but thanks so much for joining us. Caryn, I hope you've been well.
Thank you, I have. Thanks, Lester.
You've in recent times written a lot about not only the connections between gangs and police, looking at the connections between politicians and gangs and police. Clash of the Cartels looks at the connection between gangs, police, politicians, and multinational drug syndicates. Is South Africa that international drug hub that we are made to believe?
Absolutely. I mean, the book really proves that, if anything, there's so many other cases that we can look into that proves that absolutely South Africa is a pivotal core of the global drug trade. And historically so, we can go back decades and we see this. We know that the apartheid government, for example, was manufacturing mandrax. They were working with gangsters. It sort of morphed, ebbed and flowed as we moved into democracy. And the situation we're in now is because of the blueprint that was created decades ago.
Talk a little bit about that blueprint, particularly how drugs and particularly mandrax was used as a political tool. The end of the Cold War, the opening of borders, the finding a place of home or even hiding for particularly former Soviet bloc Eastern European figures, finding themselves a home. Vito Palazzolos of the world finding South Africa and particularly Cape Town a home. How does this talk to the story of South Africa as a global drug network hotspot?
So if you look at the introduction to Clash of the Cartels, I really explain why South Africa is pivotal. And one of those reasons is political. 1993, 1994, as South Africa edged towards a democracy, policing and intelligence services were amalgamated. There were shifts. And because there was so much upheaval, crooks literally made the most of that. When I say crooks, I mean we're talking real top-tier drug dealers, drug traffickers. On the flip side, there's the unnerving sort of greyish, murky arena where we've got, for example, a self-confessed drug lord who, the last I checked, was jailed in the US. He's originally from India. He used to operate by way of South Africa and in South Africa. And he's made comments before, and these are public comments, so I'm not snitching or anything. But he said, for example, he contributed to the ANC. He contributed to the struggle, which hints at potential links between one of the world's top drug dealers and the current ruling party in South Africa at the moment. And it's very terrifying, actually, because if you look at what has happened since 1994, the same self-confessed drug dealer, Vicky Goswami, in 2019 told the court in the US that him and his allies were trying to maintain control of South Africa's drug dealing networks. And he was working with a group two brothers from Kenya, and another gent who, if the US is to be believed, is now jailed in the US, and he is from Pakistan. It's scary because we don't really know much about these figures. Not much is put to us by way of the state in the public domain, but once you start looking into it, you start seeing, oh wow, there are terrifying and very obvious links to the state and these individuals.
Aron Hyman joins us here in studio. You've covered two of the biggest drug busts in South Africa's history. There was the story that broke, I think it was last year, 10 people arrested after police seized what was essentially a boatload of cocaine, but on a highway in Gauteng. It was valued at something like $500 million. Rand. There was also the case, the second largest cocaine bust here in South Africa's history, not too far from us here in Saldanha Bay. Is all this that is coming into the country feeding the South African market, or is South Africa simply being used as is legitimate trade routes, being used as the gateway to the rest of Africa?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Lester, and good morning to your audience. So you have to look at South Africa in the way that South Africa has been positioned in the global trade historically. We've always been a point on the southern tip of Africa, a point between economies, and South Africa's drug market is so if we're talking about low-end drugs, yes, of course you've got your your crystal meth, your mandrax and stuff that is being used by the local market, and increasingly heroin as well. Heroin being smuggled from Pakistan and Afghanistan, your Kandahar region. But when we're talking about your high value drugs like cocaine, the place where you want to really get cocaine to is to Australia. So all the drug cartels, all the cocaine in the world is produced in the Andes mountain range in South America. And you need to get the cocaine from the Andes mountain range all the way to Australia. Now, there's two ways of doing that. Either you go through the Pacific, the longest the longest stretch of ocean in the world, or you go via South Africa. And I think, as Caryn was pointing out now, you've got so many foreign crime actors sitting in South Africa, and also local crime actors, enablers for this whole drug network. It's a very sophisticated, very well-oiled machine. It's capitalism on steroids when you're talking about the cocaine trade. So the cocaine is uploaded there, pure cocaine, uncut, comes to South Africa in boats. We've heard recent reports of submarines crossing the ocean. So drug cartels using tailor-made submarines crossing the ocean, coming to South Africa. A little bit of that cocaine is being used locally, but here it seems that there are several massive syndicates involved in bringing cocaine to South Africa, and then they're finding buyers in countries, in your high net worth countries. So you mostly Australia. You need you get your buyers there, and then these individuals are trying to get the cocaine into Australia, and that's so you have to see South Africa as a nodal point. And one more thing that I just want to say about that is one of the enabling factors, okay, aside from the lovely climate and the nice sun and the fact that you can live a very nice life here with, if you well set, is the fact that there's an enabling law enforcement environment. You can hide here. There's also a bit of a home affairs crisis.
Let's also talk about a growing middle class, and
yeah,
you would have your high-end substances being used by a more of a middle class market. And as South Africa's middle class grows and grows, it stands to reason that consumption of substances would also then increase. Our market could in fact grow here in South Africa.
Our market is growing. It's growing quite rapidly. But we're not a high net user of a substance like cocaine yet. I think there's if
I remember a drug report saying that cannabis still classified as an illicit substance, is our number one substance, and I think after that crystal methamphetamine, and I think after that heroin. Cocaine very much on the lower end of the spectrum. But there is a moralism, Aron, particularly around substances. But we can essentially swap drugs or cocaine with anything else, whether it be
Sure.
abalone, whether it be what is it? Something that else is aloes in the Karoo, or for
Yeah.
or small succulents. This is simply just capitalism, and drug smugglers see it as that, as simply taking a commodity which under law is not allowed to be moved freely. If aloes were more of value to drug smugglers, they'd be smuggling aloe and not necessarily cocaine. This is all but capitalism.
Well, they are doing all of those different things. So when I was doing this research for the podcast, this Cape of Cocaine podcast, the Bulgarian organized crime syndicates in South Africa are involved. They were particularly involved. So you've got your 28 gang extracting abalone, or overseeing the extraction of abalone from the sea. But then the Bulgarians did the trafficking. So taking it from Cape Town to Johannesburg and making sure nobody robs them. They're also into high-tech card skimming. So, for example, if any of the listeners' cards have ever been cloned, your bank card, I'm almost 99% certain it would have been the Bulgarian mafia in South Africa who was behind that. And then they're into cocaine and perhaps other drugs as well. So this it's exactly as you pointed out. I mean, sugar is bad for us, tobacco is bad for us, alcohol is bad for us. These things are economies that are regulated, and they are some of the biggest companies in South Africa. SAB is also it's also basically in the drug trade, and now you've got people whose interest is not the safety of a child who they're selling crystal meth to, or who they're selling cocaine to. Their interest is making money, and that goes with violence, that goes with corruption. So they actively corrupting the South African government and also the South African private sector and South African individuals. So you have to ask, would it be better for a government and people in general to be involved in the regulation of these products and actively trying to encourage society?
Caryn, I've made the example of how anything in the illicit economy contributes to the overall criminal underworld. You write in your book, The Enforcers, of how it even touches down to the clubs, the bars, the restaurants that we frequent. We could easily exclude ourselves from saying, well, I don't do any drugs, I don't take any illicit substance. But if I am buying illegal crayfish, if I bought black market cigarettes during lockdown, if I frequent a place that I know has security provided by a gangster security industry, it's very hard not to be complicit in the black market trade, the underworld economy, particularly in Cape Town.
Absolutely spot on, Lester. Excuse me. So yeah, one thing I've noticed throughout all three books I've done is that no matter which way you turn, no matter which way you try and avoid crime or organized crime, no matter how much you try and separate yourself from it, it is part and parcel of the lives we live. And like you said, if you knowingly buy, for example, illegal crayfish, you are in a small way, but in a way nonetheless, contributing to organized crime. And I'll go so far as to say you're contributing to not just local organized crime, transnational organized crime. And not to sound too depressing, but the only way around this is really to keep reading, keep educating yourself, and make an active decision. Do you want to do that?
But let's get back to that conversation of what do we do, Aron. Kgalema Motlanthe, former president, who's also on various boards looking at substances and its impact on South Africa. He has called for a complete decriminalization of illicit substances in South Africa. Not that he wants people to go out and have a party. It's because let's deal with the syndicates. Let's deal with the organized crime. It's very much the conversation that we're having with decriminalization of sex work. Let's protect the most vulnerable. And if we get the syndicates, the gangs out of the way, we at least get to safeguard people.
Yeah. I haven't read his policy on that. I saw what he was saying, but the government can. We don't, as South Africans, believe that the government has our best interests at heart, and to give the government power over the distribution of dependence-inducing substances is not necessarily the right thing to do. It is in countries where the governments care for their people, and what I mean by that is that you don't want people to do these substances. You don't want people to smoke. You don't really want people to drink too much. You don't want people to you certainly don't want people to do heroin, cocaine, or crystal meth. So there's a huge philosophical and moral issue that needs to be.
There's the public health issue and the social impact on any substances, whether it be tobacco, whether it be marijuana, whether it be alcohol.
Sure. But we as so I didn't get that from what he said. But as the South African government has this thing where if it can't do what it should, it does what it can. So it just ends up doing things that does more harm than good. And if you're going to have a drug policy, you need to make sure that the revenue that you're generating from, say, the regulation of drugs needs to go into drug rehabilitation. It needs to go into drug education, all of that sort of stuff. But at the same time, you need a law enforcement environment that is rooting out the bad actors, and those bad actors will seamlessly slot in to whatever regulation or whatever drug policy the government brings in, and they'll suddenly wash all of their money, and it'll be completely legitimate.
Caryn, just your final word from you in terms of how this affects people's safety. We talk about multinational, globalized organized crime syndicates from South America to Eastern Europe, and how that affects our crime, particularly violent crime here in South Africa. There is almost a straight line between all the international, transnational organized crime syndicates to what we experience here in Cape Town, and that is particularly street gangs. It's something that we have lived with in Cape Town for decades. I see no end to it in my lifetime at least, but there's definitely this connection between from the highest of transnational organized crime syndicates, where deals are made in boardrooms, to the violence that we see on the streets of Anova Park, Manenberg, and many, many other areas here in Cape Town.
Absolutely. It's what I call street-level state capture, the real gritty, disgusting, horrific side of state capture. For example, police officers funneling firearms to gangsters, that is state capture. And yeah, Lester, how it affects us is, I'll use an example to bring it home, literally and figuratively, but a few years ago, a man was shot 32 times in South Africa. I'm not quite sure where. I suspect it was Gauteng. Vicky Goswami, the same the same criminal I mentioned earlier, he said that him and his allies planned that murder from Kenya. So a murder that played out here in South Africa was planned in another country. There were probably retaliatory shootings that we don't know about. Another man was killed outside a mosque in Cape Town. He was also linked to that same syndicate. And what we're seeing here, what we think may just be, it's another gang shooting, it's a shooting in Manenberg. This could actually be a shooting planned in another country and sort of commandeered by a global organized drug cartel. And that is the reality of organized crime in South Africa.
Caryn, Dolley, thanks so much for joining us. I'll have you have the last word here in studio with us. Aron, something else that you've researched and reported on is also online gangs. You've covered what was known in the Tableview Parklands area as I think the Black Axe Gang, a group of Nigerian nationals who use Cape Town as their hub to trick people online, romantic scams. It's a funny story because how can people fall for online romantic scams? But this also falls into the broader conversation of illicit trade and the illicit economy and even the violence that is perpetrated as something as fairly innocuous as a romantic scam. You've been covering it.
Yeah, you must be careful because there's quite a few of your listeners, especially female listeners, who will probably send you a tweet now saying, I was caught in a romance scam.
A lot of people have.
A lot of people have. We really have to say thank you to the U.S. Secret Service for the work that they've been doing in South Africa with the Hawks and with Interpol. Because the reason why the U.S. Secret Service is going after the Black Axe in South Africa is because it cost their economy. They were losing something like $4 billion in 2019 to romance scamming and BEC scamming, most of which is done by the Black Axe. The Black Axe is a cult. It's what they call a confraternity. Imagine your American university fraternities. That's the Black Axe started like that in Benin State University in Nigeria, and spread out into this prolific criminal organization. But South Africa, once again, very important for the Black Axe cult. And I don't even want to know how many South African victims there are.
And as an easy place to do business with very limited controls, easy access, and also poor online monitoring.
Absolutely.
From our side. Aron Hyman is investigative journalist. His podcast, Cape of Cocaine, is available online for Times Life. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for joining us, Caryn, Dolley. Lines are open with your thoughts